What's up guys, this is Steven from TechMaker.tv. In this video, I want to walk through a simple explanation of inheritance in object-oriented programming by going through a quick example. Now, if you are subscribed to the channel, you'll notice this is a code example we developed in a recent video on a simple explanation of object-oriented programming. I'm going to link to that video in the description if you haven't seen it, but even if you haven't, it's fine. This should be pretty basic. All of the code that you need is basically in these 4 files. So if you want to like pause and take these down or just watch, that's totally cool. So inheritance in object-oriented programming is essentially when a subclass type will inherit methods from a parent class. So a common example of this is like, animal is the parent class, and then you have dogs and cats, which are subclasses. Now, in practice, it rarely makes sense to do massive amounts of inheritance, and there's better ways to do things in a lot of cases. But I want to go ahead and explain the concept here. And I have a useful situation that emerged in our last episode that I was talking about. So we have a cake, and in fact, this is what we were talking about at the very end of the last video. Is we may change the name of this to baker. But anyway, there's a bake method, and it accepts a recipe right here. And then the recipes all have this valid method. So we're just using the recipe as a sort of a validation check, like, do we have the right ingredients here? Which makes sense. I mean, that's sort of what you do in real life, right? I mean, you get a recipe, you look in your pantry, and you say, like, does all this stuff here match what's in this list? Or you go to the store and get it, or whatever. So what I want to do is create a recipe parent class, and then we'll have these subclasses essentially inherit from that class, and we'll see what that looks like. Okay, so let's go ahead and just kick this off. So first of all, I have these tests here in this spec. So I want to just run my specs all the time and make sure they stay green. When I'm refactoring, I don't want them to go red at all, if possible. And that should be possible here because what we're going to do is just change the implementation. We're not actually going to change the behavior at all. So to start, let's create a new file and just call it recipe. And we'll say class recipe and just save that. And then over in our 2 recipe folders, we're going to just require recipe and require recipe. And again, if you're not using Ruby, the syntax for all this stuff would be different, obviously. This is just a really simple example. So we've imported all this stuff, and now we are still green. So in Ruby, how you inherit is you say basically this less than sign and then recipe. So it kind of points to the child from the parent. So let's run our tests and just keep running them. So we've already set up an inheritance structure here. So technically at this moment, both of these classes inherit from this recipe class, but it's just not that useful because the recipe doesn't do anything. So what I'm going to do, and this is going to be a pretty straightforward example, is I'm going to copy this this method, and I'm going to just paste it inside of our recipe class here. And this should still pass for everything, because what happens is even though the recipe implements this method, the subclasses override it. So whatever is in the subclass will actually be like considered the real method. So which one did we copy? I think we copied the vanilla one. So if I actually comment out this method, everything should still be green, and you'll see that we're inheriting from the actual recipe. So, and if I comment out both, you'll see that it goes red. I like to do a lot of sanity checks when I'm developing. Okay, so we're all green. And I'm going to put back my method here because, again, I don't want to go red other than when I'm intentionally trying to go red like I just was. So now you've seen how a subclass will actually inherit behavior from a parent class, but let's consider the fact that we haven't really done anything useful yet. So to make it do something useful, what I want to do actually is change this up a little bit. So I'm going to add a few methods in my recipe class. So, and you can do this like this. You can say cups of flour, and then you could actually raise an error if it's like blank and say like the subclass has to implement this. I don't really care about being that strict right now, and all of these things can really just return nil. Cups of milk. So, and because they can all just return nil, there's a shorthand for this in Ruby, which is just to say attr_reader. So we'll have cups of flour, cups of milk, and number of eggs. So now that's going to create a problem here because we really want these to not match these because these arguments need to be able to actually make sense. So what I'm going to say is just so flour quantity and then milk quantity and egg quantity. So now what we want to do is say flour quantity equals cups of flour and milk quantity equals cups of milk and egg quantity equals number of eggs. Okay, so now let's run this one more time. It should still be green because we haven't really changed anything because again the methods are overriding them. So what we can do now that's a little bit more interesting is we can say in here, let's define a cups of flour method, and we can say 3. And then in here we can say cups of milk, and then we can do 2, number of eggs 4. Now I'm well aware that this does not make chocolate cake. This is just a kind of a fake example, but let's just delete this now and let's run this. So now we're still green. Now the nice thing about this is now we don't really care about this logic for what valid is in all of our recipe classes. We just care about the ingredients quantities essentially. So now it's really straightforward to roll out new recipes because you just put the ingredient and then list the number. So we can jump over to our vanilla and we can say 2, 2, and 1, and we should still have green tests here. So I like this quite a bit, and to be honest, like this makes the test pass and so on and so forth. This would be something that would be problematic if a requirement came over that said we need to now accept different kinds of ingredients. So that is something to consider. So for example, like if we received a requirement that said we need to let people build recipes that have any type of ingredient, this list and what we would need to do to make that work would be pretty difficult here. Maybe we'll look at that in a future episode. But there's other strategies other than inheritance that would probably make more sense. So let me think on that. Maybe we'll make another episode about that. But that's basically it for this one. If you have a really simple use case like this is great. This makes your classes that you need to write very, very easy and very, very declarative. You know, it's like it's really obvious what's going on here. It's a recipe and it's telling me exactly how much I need of these things. So that's cool. The rule about inheritance is you don't want to have inheritance unless every subclass has the exact same methods with different parameters. So that's what a lot of people get into trouble about is you'll start building out subclasses, but they have similar methods, not exactly the same. That means it's not a real subclass. They need to be identical in terms of the methods that they have. So that's what I'm saying is like if you have a cake that calls for salt and another one that calls for sugar and another food that's entirely different than a cake, those things probably aren't actually subclasses. They are something that's bakeable, but they're not necessarily subclasses. So you might want to rework the entire implementation. So let me think on that. We may come back and do that again. But anyway, I think that's enough for this episode. So I will talk to you in the next one. And definitely subscribe if you like this kind of stuff because we're putting out content every day. So I will talk to you later.